It is a wonderful pleasure to welcome Sam Roggeveen. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly on this program. He is the director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, or Lowy. Um, and in this hour, we are discussing his very interesting book on Australian foreign policy. It is titled The Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace. Sam, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. An echidna, in fact, it's
Oh,
a native Australian mammal that looks very much like a hedgehog.
mhm. Okay. So I wish to begin by asking you about the institute in which you are working in, Lowy or Lowy Institute. What is its mission
Lowy.
statement and what it's about?
Well, the Lowy Institute is a think tank now in its 21st year, established in Australia by Frank Lowy, who came to Australia in the 1950s and established uh, a small business in Western Sydney that grew into a business empire, which many of your listeners would have heard of, called Westfield, that built shopping malls all around the world, many in Australia, but also in the US and the UK and Europe, and I think South America too. And on the 50th anniversary of coming to Australia, he decided to establish a think tank that would be a voice for Australia in the world and will reflect Australia's position on the world. And it's built really along classic think tank lines, like the Brookings Institution or Chatham House, which is to say that there's no Lowy Institute view of the world. All our scholars, our experts, speak in their own name. And we are independent of government, and we are independent of political parties. And in fact, often our experts will disagree with one another. So, yeah, we're committed to putting an Australian view of the world out to the world. We're well known for, in more recent years, for data-driven products like the Asia Power Index, for instance, which has become something of a signature product for us. Which you can find online, or everything we write and produce is free. And we also produce the Lowy Institute poll every year. For the last 20 years, we've been asking Australians what they think about the world and their views on Australian foreign policy and countries in our region and events around the world. So, and the Institute continues to grow and is flourishing.
Wonderful. And I also understand that you guys recently celebrated Australia Day some weeks ago. I believe it's the 26th of January. So tell me about the significance of that day.
Well, it's very much contested in Australia because the 26th of January marks the day that the first fleet landed at Sydney Cove. And so it's often referred to by Indigenous Australians as Invasion Day. Simply because that was the day in which the British colony in Australia was set up, and led to a great deal of deprivation and misery and death and destruction for the Indigenous people in Australia. These days, that's more widely recognised, and Aboriginal perspectives are included in Australia Day celebrations, but nevertheless, a lot of Indigenous Australians dislike the fact that it is marked at all as a national day.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand that this comes at the heel of the Voice Initiative, which was a national referendum that I guess didn't work in favor of the Indigenous population. Yes.
Well, certainly the result of the referendum was to reject the idea of the voice. So the voice was a proposal to create a body that would represent the interests of Indigenous people to the government and to the Parliament. and it would have required a change to the constitution to create that body, or at least the government wanted that body to be constitutionally enshrined. And so the question was put to the public by way of referendum. That's the only way you can change the constitution, is by referendum. And the referendum was soundly defeated. So the question of whether that served or didn't serve the interests of Aboriginal Australians is very much contested, but certainly we know that the referendum itself failed.
Now, let's talk about your book. Of course, you mentioned the echidna. Apologies for my mispronunciation. Is an animal native to Australia that resembles a hedgehog. That is the full extent of what I know about echidna, or I suppose Australian zoology in general. So why do you select this animal as an analogy for Australian foreign policy?
Well, on one level, it's a sort of superficial analogy with the hedgehog strategy that is often referred to in debates about how Taiwan should defend itself. But I say superficial because there is a lot more to it than that. In the introduction to the book, I also refer to Lee Kuan Yew, the founding leader of Singapore, and his reference to the so-called poison shrimp strategy, which is to say that the shrimp, which is to say small countries, often get gobbled up by big countries. So if you can be a poison shrimp, you can be too painful for big countries to swallow. So that's really another analogy there. And I think another reason the analogy works is because an echidna's survival strategy is purely defensive, which is to say it has no ability to seek out adversaries from a long distance away. It merely waits for adversaries to come to it. But if the adversaries dare to actually attack the echidna, then it can cause them tremendous pain. And actually, I think that's a very rich analogy for Australia to seek out in terms of its security policy. At the moment, I think listeners outside Australia will, if they've heard anything about Australian defence policy at all, it will be in the context of AUKUS, which is the agreement with the United States that was announced in September 2021 for Australia to buy 8 nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, and also a new design with the UK. And the point I make in the book is that the whole point of nuclear-powered submarines is that you can have long range and long endurance. And that is, in a sense, is the exact opposite of what I'm trying to evoke with the echidna metaphor. When you have long range and long endurance, you could go out in search of enemies, but the echidnas take the opposite approach. And I think actually for Australia, the echidna strategy is a more sensible approach to our defence, and we can get into the reasons why.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing should be cleared up first, in that readers of this book may misunderstand that you're advocating for a form of isolationism. So you defend your country, but you don't go out in either diplomatic or military interventions abroad. So how do you respond to that charge?
Certainly, I partially refute that claim on grounds of defence, and on grounds of foreign policy, I would entirely refute that claim. So, in terms of Australia's foreign policy and security policy, my argument is in no sense isolationist. So, let me explain. Certainly on defence policy, you could argue that there's a certain kind of isolationism, but it's not at all outside the mainstream of Australian debate to make this suggestion. In fact, traditionally, Australian defence policy has been divided into 2 schools. One, the so-called Defence of Australia school, which says that we have a defence force to defend the Australian continent. And then there's another school that's referred to as the Forward Defence School. And those are people who argue that the best way to defend Australia is not to defend the continent, but to assist the United States in managing and defending the US-led security order in the Asia Pacific. Now, I belong very much in that first school, in the Defence of Australia school. but that's a very well-established tradition of thought in Australian defence circles, so not unusual in that respect. So isolationist to a degree, but only in the sense that I think the job of the Australian Defence Force is to defend Australia, not to defend the US-led security order in the region, although we can play, some small part in that, even with the defence of Australia emphasis. On the foreign policy side, I think I'd reject out of hand the tag of isolationism on the grounds that I advocate for a much more active Australian foreign policy in our near region. So what I'm critical of in the book is Australian foreign policy activism that goes further abroad. The Quad, for instance, I think is largely a waste of Australian diplomatic energy. And I think also we are putting too much emphasis on the US alliance in our foreign policy. What I'd rather see Australia do is focus on three things, and all of these I talk about in the book. First of all, I want Australia to secure its position as the leading power, and in fact, the leader of a sphere of influence in the Pacific Islands region. And in order to do that, I think we have to make sure we remain the leading aid provider, the leading provider of remittances through our work schemes. And I think ultimately we may have to develop a kind of EU-like structure with the Pacific Islands region, so that we, bring the Pacific Islands country into a web of economic and political ties, essentially to exclude China. So the second priority is, I think, a much closer security partnership with Indonesia, something like a treaty or an alliance with Indonesia. We never call it that because the Indonesians are a bit skittish about that sort of thing. And then the third thing I'd want Australia to do is to champion the idea of developing an Asian concert of powers, which is a sort of forum for the great powers in Asia to come together to resolve their differences peacefully. And all of these are diplomatic priorities, and all of these require more ambition and actually more resources, many more resources for Australian foreign policy. So on that basis alone, yeah, I would reject out of hand the charge of isolationism.
Understand. So I know that this book came out while Australia is perhaps more entangled with the United States more than ever. You've mentioned the AUKUS alliance with Britain and the US, and there's also the quadrilateral security dialogue with India and Japan, and not to mention the Five Eyes intelligence network. So you're going against the tide here. So why do you believe that this strategic decoupling should happen?
I'm not calling for a strategic decoupling exactly. I'm not an alliance skeptic. I'm an AUKUS skeptic. So I don't object to the alliance, really. I do object to the deepening of the alliance that has happened just over the last 3 years, which has been quite dramatic. Not just AUKUS, although that's the single most prominent one. But I would say more important over the next decade will be two initiatives that the Australian government announced, which didn't get as much attention. And that is, firstly, that we're going to expand our Air Force base in Northern Australia so that it can accommodate American bombers. And secondly, that we're going to expand and modernise our naval base in Perth in Western Australia so that it can accommodate American attack submarines. Now, both of those agreements mean that for the first time since the Second World War, the US will be capable of conducting combat missions from those two bases. So that is quite that's quite a dramatic deepening of our alliance structure. And it means that in the event of war, those two sites, those two bases will be targets for China. If the United States ever went to war with China, they will be targets. So I'm not so much calling for decoupling, but I am calling for a halt, and in fact now a reversal of the unprecedented deepening of the alliance. I think that the alliance, as it existed up until about 2 years ago, was working just fine for the most part. But I do strongly object to the unprecedented deepening of the alliance. It's worth just saying, by the way, that you refer to AUKUS as an alliance. It's not exactly that. It's essentially a technology sharing agreement, and importantly, it doesn't commit the United States more to Australia's defence than they ever have in the past. So, for the United States, actually, AUKUS is a pretty good bargain. It means that Australia is spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the US shipbuilding and defence industries, and in return, the United States effectively gets a substantial submarine fleet with its closest ally, and an implicit, I think, bargain that Australia will help the United States, but will use that fleet to help the US. And it gets some pretty healthy defence contracts into the bargain as well. So it's a good deal for the US, but it doesn't actually commit the US to anything.
Of course. I wonder if you're as worried about the decline of the US as a great power in the world as I am.
Well, I think we need to be careful about the word decline in the sense that it can be absolute or relative.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of decline I'm worried about is purely relative. So absolute decline would mean that the United States GDP begins to shrink, and that its population declines, for instance, or its population ages, that its economic base becomes weaker, that its education system goes into decline, that its healthcare goes into decline. Some of those things are true. I mean, American life expectancy is actually reducing at the moment. That's a real worry. But the United States has many ingredients for ongoing health and success in the world, and I think it will be either the first or the second biggest power in the world for the indefinite future. Its demographics are good, particularly compared to China, but also compared to Europe. It has a very strong economy with an incredibly resilient economy that can withstand a lot of shocks. And it has the world's biggest military, most powerful military, and thousands of nuclear weapons. And it's protected by two vast oceans to its east and west, and by two friendly countries to the north and south. So to me, those are all very basic ingredients that speak to the United States being, as I say, one of the two biggest powers in the world for the indefinite future. So that takes care of absolute decline, but that doesn't at all take care of the question of relative decline. So in terms of relative to China in particular, which is Australia's most important yardstick, yes, the US is unequivocally in decline. And I think the most concerning thing for Australia is that the US hasn't particularly done very much to resist that trend. And look, that will surprise a lot of people to hear that, because we're used to seeing, if you follow American foreign policy, we're used to hearing claims about, America putting China now at the center of its worldview, and Washington's the most divided it's ever been, except on China, where it's absolutely united. And of course, the CHIPS Act was a major statement of American resolve. However, against that, we have to acknowledge the fact that over the 30-odd years now that China has been engaging in what is clearly the biggest military modernization of any nation since the Second World War, that over that period, the United States has done almost nothing to change its military force structure in Asia. If you look at a copy of the IISS military balance in 1991, as I have, you'll see that the number of troops and the distribution of forces then looks pretty much as it does today. There's a carrier battle group in Japan. There are about, I think, 55,000 troops. There are about 30,000 troops and 4 Air Force squadrons in Korea. Now, all of those forces have been modernised, of course, that happens over 30 years, but they haven't been expanded. The one exception is the addition of more submarines in Guam, but other than that, America hasn't been expanding its military forces. And you would think by now that it should have. If China really was as important to the Americans as they claim, then long before now, we should have seen dramatic moves. We should have seen, for instance, that the United States would have said to its European allies, you know what, you guys can take care of Russia. We're moving our forces to Asia. When the European economies collectively are 10 times the size of Russia, Europe could easily manage that problem by itself, even now, maybe even especially now, given the way the Russians have decimated their own military in Ukraine. So, if the Americans were as serious as they claim about resisting China's rise, then I think we would have seen more evidence of a rebalance of its military forces by now. But in fact, we were told about a rebalance in 2011. Barack Obama came to Canberra, my hometown, gave a speech to our parliament saying, you know, this is the pivot. We're having a rebalance of American forces and American foreign policy to Asia. Well, it never happened.
Yes. I understand that geographically, Australia is just closer to China than the United States. And of course, the rising China threat, I suppose, bears more significance to the Australian population than the United States, at least in terms of geographical distance. So, do elaborate more on China's threat to Australia.
Well, I think that the military threat to Australia has been overstated in Australia. Of course, the threat is broader than that. So there is clear evidence that China has attempted to interfere in Australian politics, for instance, that China conducts widespread espionage in Australia, that Communist Party-linked entities have bought up Chinese language media in Australia and are spreading propaganda through those outlets. So I don't at all wish to diminish the scale of China's overall challenge to Australia. But I do think the military aspect has been overstated. So there was a book that came out by a retired Australian general a few years ago called about the China threat, called "Danger on Our Doorstep." Well, if that's true, then it's a very big doorstep because Beijing's closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney. It's a long way away, and it is extremely difficult to project military force over such vast distances. So the example I use in the book is imagine if you're a military commander and your task is to hit a target over the next hill with 500 kilograms of explosive. Well, if it's over the next hill, you use mortars, or you might even, in the dead of night, you might take it across in a truck and then explode it from afar. However, if the target was 5,000 meters away, you would need artillery. If it's 500 kilometers away, you need a squadron of combat aircraft, plus the airfields and all the maintenance and everything else that goes with it. And if it's 5,000 kilometers away, you need a missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile. And that is a whole national industry to build an ICBM capability. So the point here is that at every step in that continuum, from over the next hill to 5,000 kilometers away, the costs rise exponentially. The costs rise massively. And yet the military effect you're achieving is constant. It's still 500 kilograms of high explosive all along that continuum. And so that's why distance is such a great protection for Australia, because if China ever wants to attack us, it has to overcome that vast distance. And that's technically very difficult, but also extremely expensive. So that's why I think it's very much in Australia's interest to preserve that distance. And rather than building a force structure, particularly a naval force structure that's designed to operate near China's coast, I say let them come to us if they ever want to. Again, it brings you back to the echidna metaphor. Echidnas don't defend themselves by reaching out to find the enemy. They wait for them to come.
Give us an overview of the newly elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. This is foreign policy in regards to the US and China?
I don't have a great deal of insight to offer. I recommend to your readers the speech that Mr. Albanese gave to the Lowy Institute in December. That's the last major foreign policy address that he gave. It's on our website. The 2023 Lowy Lecture, it's called. Albanese is not known as a foreign policy wonk. You know, he's not deeply invested and known to be deeply knowledgeable about foreign affairs and defence affairs. By contrast, his foreign minister Penny Wong is nowadays very deeply versed in the field. I mean, he's conducted himself very ably on the international scene as a diplomat and as a representative of his nation. He's a figure who is very much invested in the idea of his government and his party, the Labor Party, having several successive terms of office. And that means, for foreign policy, what that means is no surprises and no mistakes. So he's very conservative, and it doesn't indulge or entertain any major surprising new initiatives, and nor does he verge far from the kind of territory that the predecessor government announced. So, for instance, the AUKUS initiative has continued seamlessly since the new government was elected, since the Albanese government was elected. And it's hard to see them diverge from that path in this term and maybe even the next term, simply because this government is constantly worried that if it looks in the least like it's soft on national security, that the opposition will have a stick to beat them with, will have a weapon to beat them with. I think that fear is overstated, but nevertheless, it's very deeply ingrained in the Labor Party culture these days. So I expect the remainder of this term to continue as it has, which is to say, very conservative, small c conservative. I mean, no radical shifts.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I would really like to see is Australia acting as a sort of regional power, in that it, as you've alluded to, conduct or form alliances with the countries around the region, like Southeast Asia and also the Australian Pacific Islands, mostly to combat the influence of China, either militarily or diplomatically. And I say this because even for the most part, and I think I'm more well-versed in the Southeast Asian countries, for the most part, I think except Cambodia, all of these countries, including the country of my birth, Vietnam, are wary of China's rise and, I guess, malicious influence. But we do not trust that the United States will come through. And as such, I think Australia may be able to play a role there. So what do you think?
Well, I agree, and I think I mentioned earlier that I advocate in the book for something like an alliance with Indonesia. I do think that our recent initiatives, AUKUS and the basing announcements that I talked about, make that more difficult. I think one of the things that Southeast Asian countries worry about is that Australia is going to bring this new Cold War to their region, to their doorstep. And AUKUS, I think, does that in a very specific way, because it does give the Chinese Navy an incentive to operate around Australian shores and to target these Australian facilities. So you have to transit through Southeast Asia to do that. So if China and the US ever did go to war over over Taiwan, for instance, then Southeast Asia would become part of the battlefield. And the recent initiatives from the Australian government, I think, will raise the stakes there. And I'm writing an article about that now. So in that sense, also, I think diplomatically we make it harder for ourselves to forge these relationships in Southeast Asia, because we look more like an American proxy than we do like an independent actor. On Chinese influence in those countries, look, I am worried that that on continental Southeast Asia, and you mentioned Cambodia, that things may have already gone too far. That we can count Cambodia, for instance, as already, and Laos as being part of a Chinese sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. There's evidence now, not confirmed yet, not completely certain, but pretty strong evidence now that China's developing a naval facility in Cambodia. And that would strengthen the sense that Cambodia is now essentially bandwagoning with China. So it's very much in our interest to make sure that other Southeast Asian countries don't go too much further down that path. I mean, there's always a chance of a rapid reorientation as well, as we've seen in the Philippines. That can go both ways. But to me, the most important state in this regard is Indonesia, because for Australia, because it's geographically closest to Australia, but also it has the potential to become a great power. It's 270 million odd people, which is a huge population. It may be something like the fourth biggest economy in the world by the middle of the century. So that alone means Indonesia will be a great power. And if Indonesia can find a new identity for itself, in which it becomes not so much a pro-Western power, I don't think that will ever happen, but in which becomes essentially an independent pole, an independent counterweight to Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. I think that's very much in our interest, but also I think it's in Indonesia's interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to focus on the Australia-Indonesia relationship, because I understand that around the end of the 20th century, there was an effort there was a UN effort led by Australia to liberate East Timor from Indonesian occupation or rule. I wonder to what extent does that still hampers the relations between the two states nowadays?
Well, I'm at the very edges of my expertise here on Indonesia, but my understanding is that among some parts of Indonesia's military, this is still a very sore point and a sensitive topic, because there are some, and I don't know how many they number. I don't know how important this is, but there are some who feel that Australia essentially aided and abetted, the independence of East Timor, and so encouraged its devolution from Indonesia, and therefore endorsed the carving up of Indonesian territory, and that Australia may do the same in Irian Jaya. So there is a group, and I as I say, I emphasise again, I don't know this topic that well, and I don't know the size of this body, but there are some suspicions of that kind in the Indonesian security establishment. Against that, I think we have to weigh the fact that official, government-to-government relations between Jakarta and Canberra have never been better, and Australian government's always placed a heavy emphasis on that relationship. The biggest Australian embassy in the world is in Jakarta, and these days, I think for the last sort of 4 or 5 prime ministers, there's been a tradition that the first bilateral overseas visit that a new Australian Prime Minister makes is to Jakarta. I think that's a great tradition. It's something that I hope is continued for some time.
Mhm. Now, what fault lines in the US-Australia relationship can you name?
I think possibly the deepest one and the most important one is a difference on our attitude to China, in the sense that, and this is speculative on my part and kind of observational and could be easily refuted, I suspect, but it seems to me that the United States has not fully accepted the legitimacy of China as as a communist country and as a great power. Australia, as a middle power, has fully accepted that and regards China as not for changing. I'm not certain that that sense is deeply embedded in the American system, and in fact, there might be a sense in the US that this is not so much the relationship to manage as a system to overcome, as it did the Soviet Union. So that is a big distinction. I think if I'm right, then that's a big distinction between Australia and the US. I don't think it's a point of friction in practical policy terms, but I think it's a philosophical difference.
Mhm. Are you concerned with what historian Neil Ferguson prescribes as a second Cold War looming large?
I'm still not persuaded that we're going to be in a second Cold War or that we are in a second Cold War. And it's mainly for the reasons that I laid out earlier about the United States and its commitment to its maintaining its position, its stature in the Asia Pacific against China's challenge. And as I said, the best evidence of America's attitude there is the fact that it really hasn't changed its military posture in over 30 years. So I question American resolve. And I don't question it because as some kind of moral judgment about American courage or American character. It's really just a prudential judgment about American interests. Because China's so big, because it's easily the biggest rival that the United States has ever faced in its time as a great power, far bigger than the Soviet Union ever was in economic terms. Because of that size, the United States needs a really, really good reason to engage in a Cold War type struggle with China, as it did with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did represent such a reason. The Soviet Union was an existential threat to the United States, particularly early in the Cold War, when there was a risk that, the entire Eurasian landmass, the world island as it's known, was at risk of turning red. China, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and then spreading beyond there to various other parts of Eurasia. And if that had happened, then yes, the United States would have been in existential peril. Now, as strong as China is, that is simply not a risk. The Eurasian landmass, the world island, is not at risk of, turning red as a result of the PLA. And as I say, as big as China is, the United States remains incredibly secure because it has a vast economy, a huge military, thousands of nuclear weapons. It is not ultimately a threat from China. And on top of that, I would say that the risk of China ever becoming the dominant power in Asia has been overstated. China, I think, certainly will become the leading power, but it is well within the capabilities of Japan, India, Russia, Australia, Indonesia to contain China so that it will be the leading power but not the dominant power. So I think the prospect of the Americans, first of all, being under any physical threat from being under existential threat from China are overstated. And I think even the prospect of America somehow being excluded from Asia are overstated. Maybe its military will pull back, but even then, the United States will maintain its economic linkages with Asia. So overall, yeah, I think there's cause to question American resolve I forgot how that question began, so I feel like I've missed a step there. But
I think yes, I think I was asking about how was it the fault lines in the U.S. Australian relationship, and last into this point.
Okay.
Okay. So I wonder what do you suppose would be the overall political leanings of the Chinese population in Australia at the moment?
Well, we have evidence for that. In fact, the Lowy Institute has done research on that, but I can't cite it because I just don't remember. But we have done survey evidence, which your listeners, again, can find on our website. The report is called Being Chinese in Australia. So I'd recommend that to your listeners, but I'm afraid I can't cite the statistics. My recollection is that Chinese ethnic Chinese populations feel that China, when they're asked the same questions that we ask Australians generally about the threat that China poses, then Chinese Australians see China as being somewhat less threatening, but they're far from kind of relaxed or unworried about it. And also, interestingly, the one other thing I remember is that although they're very much engaged, deeply engaged on Chinese social media, and they get a lot of news from China that way, they're also clearly recognise the limits of Chinese media outlets and social media outlets and the kind of restrictions that those outlets are working under. So they're quite an educated consumers.
I've spent a considerable amount of time on this show discussing the divisions of American politics and society, and I wonder, since you've alluded to the contests behind Australia Day, I wonder, what do you observe to be the significant lines of division between Australians in their politics and social lives?
Well, I think actually there's a phenomenon that's common to all Western democracies, Australia and the United States included. And I mean, typically when we're talking about the United States, especially, there's a tendency to say that the most important division in American life is ideological, or between the major parties. And there's clear evidence for that in opinion polling. However, I do think that point is overstated. The more important trend in all Western democracies, to me, is that every mature democracy has a version of two major parties, or maybe three or four major political parties, one centre right and the other centre left. And generally, those were first established in the first half of the 20th century, or maybe just after the Second World War. And that's true in Australia as well. So I think the most important trend in all of these democracies is that those big centre-right and centre-left parties are all declining, all of them, systematic decline. And I think that speaks to a division in our democracies that is much more important than party division, which is a division between the public and the political elites. So because those major parties have declined, they've declined in membership, but often in most cases they are still quite powerful in parliamentary terms. So Australia's government is still dominated by two parties, so is America's, so is Britain's, despite the fact that those parties are now in free fall in terms of their memberships. But those parties don't really care so much about that. Big memberships are often a bit of an encumbrance rather than a help. The sort of the post-war period, politics changed from being labour intensive to being capital intensive. So what political parties want above all is money, is donors rather than members. And that, I think, has driven a division between political elites and the public, because the parties don't connect the public to the state anymore. So once upon a time, political parties were a way for the public to talk to the state. That's no longer the case.
I understand that both Americans and Australians are worried about the influence of Rupert Murdoch to their media diet. So I wonder if, to what extent is Rupert Murdoch a destabilizing figure in Australian politics?
Well, he's an incredibly significant figure, and the Murdoch empire is incredibly important because as important a figure as Murdoch is in American and British media, I don't think in either of those countries he enjoys the level of ownership of major media assets that he does here. So the concentration of media ownership in Australia is extreme. And so that's why the influence of the Murdoch empire is such a lively issue in this country, and has been for a generation, really, two generations. The one thing that obviously has changed in that regard is the internet. So I think mainstream media outlets altogether, not just Murdoch, but all of them, are simply less influential. The gatekeepers of the media simply can't keep out the billion voices, the billions of voices that can make themselves heard on the internet. So I do think sometimes that the debate in Australia about the Murdoch empire tends to diminish or understate the sheer decline of influence of all mainstream media, of all old media, because of the rise of the online world and social media.
What would be your prescribed course of action that Australia should take if, and this very highly likely hypothetical at the moment, China mobilizes against Taiwan?
Well, I think considering the stakes in such a war, well, first of all, let me say it depends on the circumstances of such a war, like who initiates it. And also it depends on what the Americans do. So those will be the two factors that will govern Australia's response. So if it's unequivocally, unambiguously an act of Chinese aggression, then it will be much easier for Australia to kind of develop a public case, a moral case for involvement. But of course, we won't get involved unless the United States does. And if you assume that the United States will come to Taiwan's defence, then Australia has various options open to it. Some people argue that Australia's role might be as little as basically helping to maintain peace and order in our own region, and that we wouldn't contribute forces directly to any conflict, to any combat in the Taiwan Strait itself. Others would argue that Australia should contribute, submarines, fighter squadrons. Maybe we could move a fighter squadron to Japan, for instance. We could contribute surface ships that help protect American aircraft carriers, etc. But you're asking me what I would do, and my answer is that we need to ask ourselves whether the defence of Taiwan is a vital interest for Australia, because the stakes are extremely high. If the United States did go to war with China over Taiwan, there is an incredibly high risk that such a war would escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, and we would then be involved in not just the deadliest war since World War II, but a war that could potentially threaten the extinction of the human species. So when you consider those stakes, you really do have to ask yourself, well, how important actually is this? And I mean, one yardstick for this, and I say it slightly, I don't mean this completely seriously, because I know the two places are very different, but consider Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong is now effectively, a fully fledged part of China. Has that affected Australia's interest in any material sense. Is Australia a poorer, a less secure country because Hong Kong is now a part of China? I think no. I think it's marginal at best. Now, again, Taiwan is a different case, but I think that's the kind of thinking we should be doing. And given the stakes that I talked about, I don't think Taiwan's future in any way merits an Australian military response. Much as I want Taiwan to maintain its current status, I think it would be a tragedy if China ever invaded, but I don't think Australia should go to war to defend Taiwan.
So, final question. What do you hope that Australia's role in the world stage should be?
Well, I think Australia has in recent years taken the very sensible step in its security policy of emphasising its region above all. So Australia is a Pacific and a Southeast Asian power, and its security interests are tied to its geography, and so we should behave that way in our geography. In our diplomacy. And I laid out 3 ideas earlier that I think should be, Australia's emphasis. They very much revolve around the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. Beyond that, there is plenty of scope for Australia to be a good international citizen and to be a solid ally of the United States without taking drastic new steps that we've taken under AUKUS. So, that's how I conceive Australia's role in the world.
I think that would be a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Sam Roggeveen of the Lowy Institute, for joining this program.
Thank you, John.